morning, it's Mr. Sorensen, and the machine of the day that we're going to look at today is the drum sander. So here's the front of the machine. This is the side that we're going to put our board into. The drum sander, very much like the planer, is a unique machine. It's the other tool in the shop that's going to pull the board through on its own. My role is basically to get the board in carefully, keep my fingers away from the edge or the table so they don't get pinched, keep my baggy clothes away from the table so it doesn't get pinched, and that's it. I'm simply going to wait, go around to the other side of the machine, and receive the board as it comes out of the drum sander. Now, right here we have the infeed table, just like we would on a planer, and in fact this machine looks almost identical to the planer. All the parts look very similar to the planer. The main difference in a drum sander is that up in here where the cutting is taking place, we're actually sanding. There's sanding rolls in here, and I'll show you that later. On a planer, which you see behind me, up in the top is actually a blade. So let's take a closer look here at the table. Right here is this adjustable table, the conveyor belt that is going to pull the board through the machine. Once I flip this on, the table's going to start moving. Turning the little handle up here on our control panel adjusts that speed. So if the slower I go, the more it's going to sand. The faster I go, the less it's going to sand. This is a big safety issue right here on a drum sander. If my fingers were to get pinched between the board and the table, right? Remember, unlike the planer where the table isn't going anywhere, the board is sliding over the top of my fingers, so it's going to pinch, but maybe it doesn't get dragged into the machine. On the drum sander, the machine table itself is moving slowly towards the interior of that sander, and it's going to smash my fingers if it were to get pulled in there. So extremely dangerous. On a drum sander, baggy clothing, keeping my fingers away from this leading edge, extremely important. Big safety concerns. No baggy clothes around a drum sander, and keep your fingers back from the edges when you put the boards in. Now, another little piece that you can see right here is the conveyor belt tracking adjustment. So that belt has to run straight through this machine at all times. You don't want your board slowly moving off to the side as you're trying to sand. So the belt has a tracking adjustment on either side that can be adjusted to make sure your belt is running true and accurate. Let me give you a better view of the control panel that's operating this machine. So here's our control panel, and it contains the on switch. It also contains an off switch. Now the off switch button has to be pushed in hard, and when you push it in hard, the machine will no longer turn back on. I can push the on switch all I want, it won't come back on until I pull this button back out. So it's a safety feature that means the machine cannot accidentally come on once I've turned it off and maybe I'm trying to get my piece of wood out. You can't bump into the green and have it come back on. Now, next to the on and off switch, we have the conveyor belt on and off switch, right? The table is referred to as the conveyor belt. So we have a conveyor belt on and off switch, plus we have the conveyor belt adjustment knob. And this is the variable speed knob that's going to allow us to turn up the speed or turn down the speed. This sander, a drum sander, takes off a minuscule amount of material. Imagine, right? Saw blades can cut through the material, but here we're sanding the material. We cannot take off more than maybe a 64th or a 32nd at most per pass. In fact, you generally are going to make multiple passes at the same setting before you try to move it on to another dimension and continue your sanding. Now here on the top in the front left corner of the drum sander is the elevation crank handle. And by turning this left or right, it's going to either raise or lower the in-feed and out-feed table up and down. You can see here it shows you which direction it's going to go by turning it left or right. Connected with that, here in the front, is the depth gauge. And One side is in metrics, one side is in fractions. We've got a little arrow or a little red line here. And it's really important with a drum sander, because we're sanding, that we take precision amounts off. We cannot just say, hey, that's close enough. A drum sander with sandpaper in there, sanding as fast as it cannot remove a lot of material at one time. So I have to have this set precisely. And in fact, I prefer to have it set incorrect. I want the opening to be way too big. I want to put the board through and have nothing happen. I would rather do that than stick it in there and have the opening be too small and the board try to force its way into an opening that it just can't make it into. A planer could cut all that surface off. If I got it a little off, cutter blades could get rid of that wood, no problem. But a sandpaper, it cannot do that. And so the board will get in there and get stuck, and it rips the sandpaper off, and it's going to put strain on the motor. It's going to create huge problems for a sander. So measuring precisely and getting this set is critical for a drum sander. When I use the sander, I'm never looking into the machine. Instead, I'm standing up, but I'm standing on the side of the machine where the controls are. I stand upright to the side of the machine so that if things shoot out, I'm not in their path. The same thing is true on the outfeed side of the sander as well. I never stand here directly in front of the outfeed side of the sander where the piece of wood is coming out, and I never want to lean over and look into the side that has the outfeed table. That's when the piece of wood could choose to shoot out of the machine if I'm standing here with my face looking in. I know the piece of wood is in there. I saw it go in, it's not coming out. So my best bet is to go turn the machine off and then wait for the machine to stop, lower the table, and try to figure out why did the piece of wood get stuck in there. When I use a drum sander, my clothes should fit tightly. No baggy clothes, no shirts that are left hanging out. Those are perfect items to get gripped by the table and the board and pulled in. I also want to keep my fingers away from this table surface when I insert the board so that my fingers don't get pinched in there and then pulled into the machine. Another safety rule that I want to follow when using a drum sander is that I never put two pieces of wood into the drum sander side by side at the same time. Now, here's why that's important. The drum sander, along with the sanding drums, it has some rubber rollers in there. Those rubber pressure rollers are keeping the piece of wood pushed tight to this bottom table so that the bottom table will pull the board through. They are spring loaded. They are spring loaded. They're also keeping the board, right? When I apply sandpaper is rough, it's like little fingers. When I apply those little fingers to the board, the little fingers are going to want to grip the board and throw it out. I have to somehow hold the board while the sandpaper is pushing on it. Much the same way that if I'm standing at a table or a bench using a belt sander or a palm sander, I would need to hold onto the board. If I just put the board there and touch the sander to it, the board's going to want to move all over the place. So these rubber rollers in this interior of the drum sander are holding the board down on the table. That's allowing it to move through, and it's keeping the board from shooting out when the sandpaper touches it. If I put two different boards next to each other, one a little thicker than the other, that's going to lift the rubber roller up off of the second board. Now this board has no pressure pushing it down to the table. It also has nothing gripping it when the sandpaper hits it, and it's very likely that the second board, the smaller of the boards, is going to launch out of the machine. So what's the rule? Never put two pieces of wood into the sander at the same time side by side. I can put two pieces in as long as they follow each other. I can put that piece in, as soon as it goes in, I'm going to put the next piece behind it. That's perfectly okay, but I never put two pieces side by side through the machine. Now, much like the planer, the dust collection ports on a drum sander are not optional equipment. You're not going to run this machine without a dust collector on. You're going to be standing in a giant cloud of sawdust very quickly. So, very important on a drum sander that the dust collector ports, which are here on the top of the machine, are hooked into a dust collector system, and it's in use at all times while running the drum sander. Now, here we are on the outfeeds table side of the machine. And so this is the side that the board is going to come out on. You can see here that the table has its own motor on a drum sander. So here's our conveyor table motor that's going to drive the conveyor table to pull the board through, and then the machine itself has a separate motor that's going to actually run the sandpaper on the inside. Let's take a look at the sandpaper of this machine. Well, if I open up the machine, I can see inside what's doing the work. The drum sander is a little more dangerous than a planer in that while the moving parts are definitely encased inside, hard to put my fingers in, the moving table definitely is a problem. Now, inside the housing of the drum sander is 2 drums that are containing the sandpaper. The first drum tends to have the rougher sandpaper on it. The second drum is going to have a finer grit sandpaper on it. So we can actually take off more material and then clean up and put a finish sand on it as the board comes out the other side. These can all be adjusted to make sure that that sandpaper is sitting perfectly flat across the table so that my piece comes out the other side nice and uniform in its thickness. Now, when I go to do my sanding, the first thing I got to do when I approach this machine is I got to measure. So because I never take off more than about a 30-second or less of material from a board, then I have to know before I stick the board in how thick it is, and I have to set the machine accordingly. So I'm going to grab my ruler or my tape measure here, and I'm going to measure it. So this piece of wood has gone through some machines already. It's 9/16 of an inch. I'm going to come over here to the table adjusting crank handle, and I'm going to look at my scale down here, and I'm going to set it to 9/16. Now, I would rather it be too large an opening. I would much rather put the board in and have it go through and nothing happen to it than to stick the board in and have it be too tight. I can always raise the sandpaper up, but if the board goes in and it's too tight and I have it set wrong, I may not get another chance. It might immediately destroy the sandpaper, and literally it can destroy the machine. It can mess up the machine so that the machine is not sanding flat, and then I end up with all sorts of problems. So I would much rather err on the side of caution, make the opening too big, and then the other way I'm going to really gauge how I'm doing on the sander is I have to listen to it. When I put a board in, I can hear it start to sand. And I can tell, is it sanding too much or is it just about right? So I have it set at 9/16. My board is 9/16. I'm going to put it in there and gauge how do I think it is. Am I right on, or do I need to raise it up just a little bit to engage the sandpaper? All right, well, I think we've set it up correctly, and you've seen a lot of the issues that we want to be concerned with as we run a board through the drum sander. Now let's run the board through so you can see it up close and personal. The last thing I want to do here is make sure my gate is open. The gate on a dust collector system is going to allow the air to suck up out of the machine and up into the trash cans outside. So the last thing I do is always make sure the gate is open. Even if the dust is on, the dust collector's on, if the gate's closed, there's no air getting sucked out of the machine. So last thing I did there was open the gate, make sure that's ready to go, and now I'm ready to run my piece through the machine. So you can see these black marks on the board. The black marks on the sandpaper put the black marks on the board. That's because no sanding is taking place in those areas, right? The sandpaper, the grit is all gone off the sandpaper in that black mark. So now you just got this really tight surface that's being spun around and putting huge amounts of friction on the board right there. So what does it do? It burns it. And I can also feel an indentation. The sandpaper, there's a bump on it, puts a indentation in this board. So that sandpaper needs to be changed so that we're ready for some proper sanding on a good piece of board. But you get the idea of how this is working, right? That's the process of using the sander. Well, I hope you've enjoyed getting to see this little machine at work. Actually, it's not a little machine, it's a pretty good sized machine. And it's not a necessary machine in a shop. You can get by without it, but it certainly speeds up the process in a lot of different applications by having a drum sander that can pull a board through on its own and sand up to 24 inches wide. That's an enormous amount to sand in a very, very short amount of time. Well, we'll see you next time. Hope you enjoyed the drum sander.